Ave, true to Christ. Hey everybody, this is Charitable Christianity, and today we are going to be talking about Methodism, and this video talking about that non-denominationals should become Methodist. Now it's interesting, before I get into anything, if you guys are looking for a Bible study, research tools, AIs to talk to, or people to fellowship and connect with, maybe do some soak prayers, maybe do some Bible studies, go to the link below in the description to join the Discord. You're welcome to come in and join it. But other than that, with this video, it's interesting because I used to be a Methodist when I ended up falling away from the Catholic Church. I became Methodist for about 5 months, got membership in the church I was going to, and then also became anointed in the Protestant church. It really opened my eyes, and Methodism doesn't give enough to really satisfy me like the Catholic Church can. So coming from that perspective, I think this is going to be really interesting, because when I started, both my mom and my dad were lukewarm Christians. As my parents went through their divorce, my mom went from lukewarm Christian to Buddhist, from Buddhist to Wiccan, became a high priestess in the coven she was a part of, and then the coven fell apart. And I spent most of my life being bisexual and atheist, eventually pansexual. I had a stint with gender fluidity that I went through. So I have a very unique experience on that, but now, I'm straight. I am Catholic. I'm, depending on how my finances go, in February I should be back on the dating market to finally find a wife, and my training from God will finally be over. But we'll see what this video had. I watched like a couple of minutes and I was like, I'd rather have a fresh reaction to this, so we'll get to it. Alright, let's see it.
Hello, and welcome back to the Methodist Perspective. I recorded this video and realized I didn't like it, and that I needed to re-record it. So I am. I'm also sorry for the long hiatus between my last recording and this release. I will try to be more consistent in the future. Today, I want to talk about why Methodism is a more desirable home for non-denominational Christians. Just generally, of course, but for non-denominational Christians who want to get in touch with history a little more, who maybe feel that the evangelical non-denominational environment is not one that is conducive to connection to the past and to the rest of the church. I believe that Methodism does this the best, and I will then give my reasons why I believe that non-denominational should instead be Methodist. So I like to characterize Methodism as...
So before he even gets into this argument, listen, if you guys want to have the most history or the deepest church you want to find, you would want to look more towards the original, builders of the church. So if you're going to go Protestant, you're looking at Presbyterian, Lutheran, or Anglican, because Methodism is an offshoot of Anglicanism. So him using this argument doesn't actually apply to Methodism. You would actually want to go towards Anglicanism. Now, Wesley was an interesting guy because he felt like the Anglican Church didn't exactly have the full idea, came up with the quadrilateral of what you need to focus on to have a truly faithful life, instead of the triangle that most Protestants would come up with on the virtues or the values you need to withhold. But experience being one of the additional things to the triangle of values that the traditional Protestants would come up with. And then, if you go deeper, you would have Orthodox. Orthodoxy would be deeper than Protestantism and has a deeper, richer past than Protestantism. But then if you want to really get to the source, you have to go with Catholicism. That's going to give you the most magisterium. That's going to give you the most liturgy. That's where you're going to find the fullness of the truth in it. And as we go on, I'm sure that a lot of what he's talking about is going to, interestingly, you're actually better off with the logic he's using to go towards the Catholic Church.
What I call sacramental evangelicalism. So what do I mean by this? By evangelical, I mean intensely focused on evangelism, bringing people to the gospel, bringing the gospel to people, more accurately, desiring inward religion, the new birth, the witness of the Spirit and assurance, faith, justification by faith alone. These things I would say characterize evangelicalism. That certainly is I think that's all the good that we get out of sort of evangelical non-denominationalism. These are all great things. I think that they comprise, for the most part, the Methodist spirit. And so that is what I'm going to get at with evangelicalism. What does sacramental mean? I'm thinking in terms of the liturgical tradition and our view of the sacraments. Really affirming and believing and applying to our lives the idea that God has given us physical means by which he gives us his grace, which is a really historical Christian view. The idea that there is true grace in baptism, the idea that there is true grace in the Eucharist. It's not merely a remembrance of Christ's sacrifice, but a partaking in it in a spiritual manner by faith. The baptism is not just a symbol by which we profess our faith or an act of obedience to God, but it is instead a means
this is
that
a
God
based
uses to give us
Methodist,
the
man.
grace of the Holy Spirit and justification and bringing us into his church and giving us these covenant promises. Fundamentally, it is just a different way of viewing the church. Church in Methodism is not about a group of individuals coming to share their faith together, but it is a covenant institution, a covenant nation almost, certainly a covenant community in which the promises of God are kept and protected, and which is connected not merely by a common belief, but by a common spirit and by a common institution. There is therefore a sense of a sort of idea of covenant theology where indeed the church is the people of God. Not that it is the collection of individuals of God, but that it comprises one people, much like a nation, much like a country. So that's what I'm looking at as sacramental. So evangelical and sacramental, and these go together. I believe that Methodism, true Methodism, is the perfect marriage of this evangelical tradition and this sacramental tradition. The traditional American Methodism has deep liturgical traditions, which are, of course, still evident even in the modern UMC hymnals. United Methodism specifically, I would advocate for here.
Oh, United Methodism.
Because the United Methodist Church is the production of unifications, whereas something like the GMC is going to be the result of schisms and the result of disunity. And so that is why I would advocate for United Methodism as opposed to Global Methodism, not because the UMC has no problems. We all know that it does. But I believe that it is the most faithful expression of the institutional early church, and I will go deeper into that later in this video.
I hope he does, because with the United Methodists, let me look up because I remember there was like this issue with gay rights or something like that. United Methodist gay controversy. Ordination of gay clergy. I guess that was it. Yeah, because they were allowing LGBTQ AI plus ministers and congregants being allowed into leadership and to lead churches. This was and a lot of the views on sexuality in the Methodist Church, I remember, was a little bit concerning. I know there was like one. So that got repealed in May 1st, 2024. So they were able to revoke that. Thank God for that. They were able to realize the error of their ways. There had to be like one. Wait. We have another one from AP News. But then on May 5th, they removed the denominational bans on gay I keep saying it wrong, gay clergy and same-sex marriages. So there's a problem with activism in the United Methodist Church that I remember being a huge issue. And I get it, he thinks that this is the closest thing to the institutional church. But the fact that you're saying the Methodism is the closest thing to a marriage of evangelical, evangelicalism and sacramentalism, that shouldn't be the case. There should just be sacramentalism, and people convert to the fullness of the faith. Because if you have like a combination of something, or you're cross-classing, if you've ever played Dungeons and Dragons, you know that when you cross-class, you're able to get the abilities of both, but you're not going to be mastering one or the other. You're just borrowing from both categories. And what happens when you borrow from both categories, you create... it is really easy to fall into a categorical error, as we're seeing with the fact that they're allowing gay clergy. They were going to repeal it, but I guess that didn't actually pass on repealing the bad decisions that they made. And now they have opened the floodgates. From what I remember, too, they did allow female pastors in the United Methodist Church as well. That one, I couldn't really give you a source on that, so you'd have to look it up yourself. But in my own experiences with, I was specifically in Free Methodism, which is closer to Pentecostalism with Methodism. It's like one step before Pentecostalism. But anyways, the point of this is that I get that he's saying like this is the closest to the early institution. I hope that he's going to give us the reasons and have like a good logic for it. But it's not looking good so far. And he's also going to have to argue why you shouldn't choose original Methodism, which is Anglicanism, which is even more liturgical than Methodism is. So I'm interested to see how he's going to bridge that cognitive dissonance.
And in a future video. So we have roots, Methodism has roots in that adaptation of evangelism to the situation that I believe kind of is part of what characterizes the evangelical spirit of modern non-denominationalism, but which I think is perhaps misapplied in non-denominationalism.
I could say the same thing about Methodism.
John Wesley famously is invited by George Whitefield to preach in the fields, and John Wesley is absolutely appalled by the notion. And he says that he would have thought the saving of souls almost a sin if it had not been done in a church. This sense of propriety was so strong in him that he had a initial aversion to preaching in the fields. He eventually overcame that, and the effect was immediate, and it was incredible. It was huge. Bringing the gospel to people who had previously been shut out from it, who previously would not have been caught dead in a church, and they are now worshiping God. Having had no hope, they are now worshiping God full of hope because of the gospel. And that is the evangelical spirit today. That was the evangelical spirit of Methodism. The Reformation is a doctrinal revival. Methodism is a spiritual revival of it's an evangelistic revival, and it is a revival of a focus on biblical holiness, less doctrinal in its nature. And to that end, its doctrinal standards are very open. Most of our doctrinal standards are just basic Christian orthodoxy. Jesus is God, God is Trinity, those sorts of basic ideas, right? Christ came in the flesh, died for us, original sin, these sorts of basic ideas. It does add on to that a basic Paedo-Baptist sacramental tradition. And that's where the combination comes in of the mere Christianity, but it is a sacramental mere Christianity. It isn't an asacramental sort of lowest common denominator doctrine or doctrinal.
So let's see if he has
statements. We are, I would say, Paedo-Baptist evangelicals, we could say, as opposed to the Baptists, who, of course, are Credo-Baptist, who only baptize adult converts. But, of course, Paedo-Baptism is not opposed to evangelism. All of the First Great Awakening...
Okay, so he's going to go on. But with what he's saying, there's a real huge concern. So the idea of bringing the gospel to other people, that now it's not so much that we need to be speaking the gospel in church. We need to open it so we can have more efficacious ways of bringing people to the faith. And I like that because I come from an atheistic background, and that sounds appealing to me. But because it sounds appealing to me, that's how I know that it's not the right way to go about things. We still need to maintain the church. We still need to have that strong foundation of the church. But we definitely do need to have ways that we can invite people into the church or into planting those seeds of faith in them without making concessions of the faith. And when he keeps talking about these combinations that he's making, that Methodism is making, you've missed the point and completely missed your stop on the train. Where now it's no longer about maintaining the traditions of the church and making sure that we live the traditions, we properly worship God, we make sure that everything's good. And instead what's happening here is Methodism wants to make a melting pot of different ingredients of the faith to be able to create that evangelical spirit, embolden that evangelical spirit that he's talking about, so we can have a stronger faith through that. What he's talking about is adding on the traditions of men to the faith. And you might say, well, no, it's not adding on the traditions of faith. We're just adding to the great foundation that we already had. And that's the concern I have, because since John Wesley separated from the Anglican Church, you have 2 degrees of separation. You have the original Reformer separation of the Reformers cutting that apostolic succession line and then doing their own thing. And then John Wesley ended up parting from Methodism, or from Anglicanism, to form his own denomination, and is another degree of separation from that apostolic line. So I'm interested to see how you would bridge that gap, that being so far away from apostolic Christianity, and how you would have the authority to know and to preach, or to know that you're speaking properly and teaching properly, and how you have that authority to teach.
People were, most of them, some of them were Baptists, but most of the people, the evangelists of the First Great Awakening, were Paedo-Baptists. So it's not opposed to evangelism. We do have a theological tradition, but it isn't imposed upon the individual through the doctrinal standards. It more is just incidental. The Methodist Church tends to be Wesleyan Arminian. It is not completely Wesleyan Arminian, but it is mostly Wesleyan Arminian. But we are more focused on the acting out of the faith. So, to be fair, there is some difficulty. What is the Methodist view on such and such a thing? Well, if our doctrinal standards don't cover it, then we don't have a Methodist view of it, really. We may have a Wesleyan Arminian view, but we don't have a Methodist view. A Wesleyan view would probably be, like, what's the Wesleyan view of sanctification? Or what's the Wesleyan view of soteriology? Well, you can have answers to that. What's the Methodist view of soteriology? Typically, that's going to seem synonymous with the Wesleyan view, but it doesn't have to be. And that's exactly the point, is that we have a theological tradition, but it is not required of the person who converts to Methodism. Convert, I, of course, use colloquially here. So we have everything that is taken for granted.
I would then ask you, why is it not required? Why would you not equip them with the proper understanding of the faith? And you could say, well, Catholics do the same thing. Kinda. When they go through faith formation, they're taught the history of the church. They're taught, and they're not taught like in depth. They're just taught like how to understand the faith, how to grapple with these theological concepts, and they're encouraged to continue seeking and going deeper. But you do have to understand what you're getting into before you can be baptized, before you can be confirmed. And it's deeper than what you see in the Protestant churches, where you just have to show them that you have a strong enough faith. And once you've satisfied their human reasoning, then you become a member of the church.
Evangelistic fervor, zeal for the new birth, inward religion, witness of the Holy Spirit, and sort of doctrinal openness, such that we can have theological diversity. Even
I don't
within
like
the
that term,
unity that we have in
doctrinal
Scripture
openness.
and in our basic doctrinal standards and basic Christian identity. We have all of that.
How do you find objective truth if you have a doctrinal openness? What limits are you putting on knowledge? What limits are you putting on subjective versus objective truth? How do we come to truth if you're doctrinally open? That doesn't make sense to me.
That all the things that are taken for granted in evangelicalism exist in Methodism as essential to Methodism, as the things upon which Methodist revival was born and was built in the early Methodist movement. It's not special to non-denominationalism. None of these things are unique to modern evangelical non-denominationalism.
I would agree with that.
They did not start these things. They inherited them. They did not start the things. So
that's true.
If you want these principles, but you also want a connection to history and an ethos that doesn't say, hey, let's be individual churches and do our own thing so we don't have any connection to other churches with any sort of doctrinal impositions. We're just going to, maybe we'll work with other churches, but we don't want to really have any, we don't want to be beholden to those other churches. We don't want to have connectional, institutional ties to them. If you're going to say, look, we are all one church and we should have we should have some doctrinal statements that are common to all the churches in this institution. We should have institutional ties. But I also don't want overwhelmingly precise and complete doctrinal impositions such that there's no room for disagreement, or there's very little room for disagreement, as I would say characterizes the Lutheran.
Wait a second.
Not to say there's no room for disagreement.
That's a really concerning view that you have,
By
sir.
and large, there's a lot of clarity, which is attractive to some people, but there's also very little room for diversity.
So this incredibly concerns me, because what I would ask you is, what is objective truth then? Is it not precise doctrinal statements that we need to follow? Like, for example, would you not consider God being a trinity of three persons, one God, essential for the faith to believe that? Or do you believe that there should be some disagreement there, that there should be some diversity in that thought? And if you believe that there should be that diversity and there should be that disagreement, you don't believe in objective truth. You only believe in subjective truth. You believe in relativism, which is the death of religion. And if you believe that we should have disagreement for healthy discussion, yeah, but we should also have objective truth that we can compare and contrast where the truth is. And this is why what concerned me when I was part of the Free Methodist church I went to, a lot of the way they worshipped and a lot of the ways that they entered into their relationship with God was based on their feelings and their perceptions of the world. And I realized that there just wasn't a lot of authority in that church, and there just wasn't any reason that I should take this seriously. Because how do I know that I'm actually getting the truth of God? God can definitely work through them to make good things happen, but if they're impeding God's process, leaning on their own understanding and doing things their own way, walking away from what God's tradition is, how am I supposed to know any better? So I sought the answers myself and tried to go to multiple denominations to figure out where I could find the answers in. And I came to the conclusion that, just like he's talking about, if you want to have that connection to history, the richest history that you can have connection to is the 2,000 years that the Catholic Church has been around. But if you just try to go with the Reformers, you're looking at 400 years at worst and 700 years at best. But it is going to be nowhere near to the richness of Orthodoxy or of Catholicism. And all his arguments that he's talking about, you might as well just go Anglican and move away from Methodism. Unless you're looking for that openness, but then you're just making the same mistakes that non-denominational evangelicals are doing.
If you want that, become Methodist. Simply put, if you want sacraments, if you want church history, but you also want freedom of theology beyond the basics, beyond the essentials, be a Methodist. Now, there's one more element to Methodism that I think is really important.
I just want to make sure that we're clear on the argument he's setting down, that what he's saying is that if you want to be a little more liturgical, but you still want to have that freedom of what you believe and what you want to believe in, you should come to Methodism. On one hand, it's nice because I see it as like a web that Methodism is trying to catch them in so that they can eventually be pulled into, the fullness of the truth, because they'll eventually level themselves up. But if you're looking for that scholarly or that liturgical element, again, if you're going to stay Protestant, you're better off going with Anglicanism at that point, because you're actually going to be connected to the actual reformers and not offshoots of the reformers.
And that is our unique focus on pursuing holiness. Every other Christian denomination has a notion of the pursuit of holiness. They all want sanctification, they all believe in sanctification, but the Methodists have such a unique focus on it that our name is derived from an insult about our methodical approach to holiness. The way we approach holiness is the source of our name. It is essential to Methodism. And what I was talking about earlier with
but what if your method is wrong?
Having this sort of this evangelical ethos.
How do you know your method is right?
I would say they have a very Methodist spirit. A lot of non-denominationals have a Methodist spirit in many respects, but one respect in which they rarely do. And I
think this is incredibly disrespectful to look at their faith and say, "Oh yeah, you guys just have the same kind of denomination that we have." It seems to me more like you see Methodism in their faith, and you're doing an application error. You're doing a categorical error, where you're trying to put them in the wrong category. They are evangelical for a reason. They might have like fruits that you guys are producing, but the fact that you guys are so close should give like red flags if they are so close, but all they got to do is just a couple of things. Shouldn't that put your faith into question of how legitimate is Methodism?
Only know non-denominationals, and there are a lot of non-denominational Christian groups on campus, and this is my experience on my college campus. This is my experience with them. The pursuing of holiness takes a backseat to vague notions of fellowship, to Bible study, which is of course important, but it tends not to be. First of all, it tends not to be particularly deep. I have found, but also it isn't geared toward a rigorous, methodical, disciplined approach to holiness.
I would agree with that.
And that is something that I think is really, really important today.
100%.
The reason why the modern Methodist denominations have such a problem today is because we have gotten rid of this. The reason the United Methodist Church has such trouble is because it has not followed this, because it has not focused on Scripture holiness. So, to recap,
you basically just sold your whole argument there, sir. The video is over at that point, because if you understand that the United Methodist Church has given up the ghost and has fundamentally missed the methoding that they're supposed to be doing, the rigorous methodology, why now should I trust Methodism? If anything, you've made a PSA and an argument that hurts Methodism more than it actually helps Methodism. So all the arguments that he's saying, I like where his heart is and where he's thinking from, but I don't think he realizes that the damage this does optically to Methodism, and the Catholic Church is just going to be a way better choice, because you're going to have a consistent catechism that's going to have consistent teaching on what different things the Bible we're supposed to believe. If you go into a catechism, This is the Ascension Press version. If you go into the Catechism, at the back you have a list of different concepts that you might be wondering about, and you can find it. And then when you go to the concepts, at the bottom you'll see footnotes where you can read more church documents. And most of the church documents you're going to be reading are usually from Vatican II, the Ecumenical Council Vatican II. You know, like Digitate Humanitas Nostrae Aetete, Lumen Gentium, just to name a few off the top of my head. You're going to be able to study for hours and learn all sorts of things. But Methodism, there's this sleight of hand that Protestantism does where they're like, we have a rich history, and if you're part of the Presbyterian, Lutheran, or Anglican movements, yeah, you are actually deeply connected to the Reformers, and you probably follow a specific article of faith. But if your article of faith is just your website saying, this is what we believe, and you don't have anything that goes beyond the last 200 years, you're so many degrees separated from the apostolic succession that you would be better off absolving into the traditional Protestantism. If you're going to stay Protestant, you might as well just get away from all these other denominations and go Presbyterian, Lutheran, or Anglican. Anyways, guys, I think that this is a good place to stop. The main takeaway that I want you guys to have from this is that when you are discussing these things, try not to judge your opponent and think that they're an idiot or think that they're stupid. They may be misguided, or they may know what they're doing, or maybe they have these intentions, but we don't know for sure. So it's important that we remember that when we are thinking about these things. So if you guys want me to make a video about why you should be Catholic, I could make that video. Just let me know in the comments if you want to see that. Feel free to tell me what you're thinking. I hope that you guys have a wonderful, blessed day. Tell me what you think of Methodism and what you think is what non-denominational Christians should convert to and why. I'd love to start a discussion on that. But I hope you guys have a wonderful, blessed day, and peace be with you all. And I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.